any adapter.
I have mini HDMI, which is the most useless connector. Hopefully, just magically appears. This is like the first time that's ever worked. So I'm going to be talking about GraphQL today. Just curious who's using GraphQL right now? Anybody? No GraphQL. This is perfect because I'm a relative GraphQL beginner. I'm needing it in my work now, and I got kind of tired of REST APIs for various reasons. So I've been exploring this, and I think this is going to be a talk where we're just having kind of a big overview of GraphQL, maybe its advantages over a REST API, and then mostly looking at a number of examples and how we can use it. So GraphQL is not a database, it's a query language that sits on top of a database or any sort of data you have actually. So you have a lot of wrappers. You have a lot of adapters to various DBs, Postgres, MySQL, and then I'm sure there's GraphQL for Redis, and I know there's GraphQL for Firebase and all of these different things. So it kind of, one advantage over REST is it just standardizes your workflow. If someone knows how to work with GraphQL, they're going to know how to work with your API immediately. And also it can wrap any data source. So you might fetch some data from somewhere, do some data mangling, and output it. Well, you can write a GraphQL schema that's going to take that data and present it to your clients in a reasonable way. So why GraphQL over a REST API? So 10 years ago, we only had really desktop applications where we had single purpose APIs. We're going to have one consumer that needs, every client needs the same thing. They're all working on the desktop. Now we have mobile, desktop, embedded, and on those a variety of different devices. Maybe we have devices with bad networks, or we have devices that have various constraints. So different clients have very different needs. The problem with REST is that you end up building one solution for everybody. So if you need an extra field in the API, I add it for everybody, and everybody pays the data charges, and so on and so forth. I found myself in a previous life, I was working on a startup that was doing sort of a collaborative software, a collaborative authoring platform, and I myself built a very poor man's version of GraphQL that was only a single use, and nobody really understands how it works but myself. So this is kind of your typical REST workflow. Sorry, so I picked this image off of a talk that I'll link to in the notes. So this is a typical REST situation, right? We have users, we have posts, we have followers. So we want to get the users, their posts, and who follows them. So the way we do this in REST is we make 3 requests, and this is 3 trips to the server. You can imagine just extending this to lots and lots of other things, and this is often what happens on, often in a client you tend to have a God page that has a lot of different stuff going on, and you're making 20 requests to the server for all the various things. Well, with GraphQL, that just transforms into a single request for a single thing, and as the front-end developer, you get to just decide what you want, and you take it. The basic structure of GraphQL is what's called a schema. It's basically you just have you define some types and you define fields on those types, and then you have functions which define how you go and fetch those fields. So if you're using a standard database, then a lot of this can be taken care of for you. But if you're doing something like our first example, we're just gonna build that ourselves. So now we're to the actual examples, and I think the reason I think this is example heavy, I really, really like one tool in GraphQL a lot. I wish it existed as nicely in other databases, and we're going to go down and we're going to look at a Goodreads example and see how it works. So we're going to get to the tool in 2 seconds. But this is so we have some Rails developers here. Nobody's okay. So we have some Rails developers and front end like JavaScript developers. Python developers, okay, yeah. Okay, so this is just this is your standard Express server, and it mounts a GraphQL endpoint. And I'll try to go quickly over the code that's not super important. And it has this thing called an auth loader and a book loader. So I should mention this is for does everybody know Goodreads? Goodreads is like rating systems for books. I personally don't use it. I just signed up because it makes for a cool demo. By the way, I did not build this. I slightly modified this code. This was an existing repo, which I'll also provide in the notes. I think it's a really good starting point. So these two offloader and book loaders, if we look up here, what they're really just doing is they're fetching some data from Goodreads. So if I go up and I go to Goodreads here, so this is Goodreads, and then I can go and I can make a request with my API key, which I hope you guys don't copy. And it gives me some XML data. And XML data, we all don't like working with it. And we're going to transform that into a GraphQL endpoint. So if we look here, we have a way of fetching the author data and a way of fetching the book data. One slight side note is this promisify is a pretty cool little utility I didn't know about. It takes any sort of callback-based function and turns it into a promise. Really like that because everybody should be using promises. And so we just fetch the data from Goodreads, and then we parse it from XML to JSON. That's pretty simple. And then we have this thing called, so this endpoint, we're returning, so we have this thing called a schema and a context and this GraphQL. So this GraphQL is the amazing tool I'm talking about, and I'll show it in a second. The context is just, so the schema is where all our types and our fields live, and the context is if we want to pass in, say, what our current user is, or various, any sort of data we're going to need to compute fields or to access these types of things. And then it just listens on a port. That's pretty normal. So if we go to the schema file, we get some stuff. It makes sense to start from the bottom and go back up to the top. So we export this GraphQL schema. It has a name. So there's three things you can do in schemas. You can have a query, you can have a mutation, or you can have a subscription. And we're only going to talk about the first two today. So query, getting data; mutation, modifying data; subscription, you're subscribing to events, so you can have some real-time interaction there. So in the query, so this query, so you have this top-level field. This is so every query has a top-level field, and that's kind of the only thing you can do at the top level is whatever is listed in the fields here. Did we see? Yeah. Okay. So in this case, it's just this author type, and if we look up at the author type, very simple. It just has a name. GraphQL gives us some types that we have to use, so it's a GraphQL string, and then a way to get the name from that XML that we parsed before. Same thing for the books, and now I think it makes sense to just go and play with it a little bit to see what this gives us. So this is our setup. Not a lot of boilerplate going on there. And then right now we have nothing. So this is GraphQL. It's an interactive data explorer for GraphQL, and it's pretty spectacular. I don't know in this case if the docs are interesting. I'll show that in a second. But so we have a query here. It throws an error because we're not doing anything. So now if I hit Control Space, I'll get a selection of what I can do on GraphQL. So even if I'm connecting to a GraphQL endpoint that I have no idea what it does, I can already see that I can call this author. So I can try and run this. Well, I get an error. It already auto-filled in this name for me, but I get an error. I actually know that I have to go here and I have to pass it an argument. So in the queries can take arguments just like a normal function call. So here I can call, say, author 100. And then that's going to get this guy, Peter Akenstein. I've never heard of him. And I can actually just look at what else is available. So I can go again and I can say, okay, well I can get his books. So I go through the books, and there's my books. Okay, that's pretty cool. And I can go here and I can look again. It has a title, so I can get the authors. I actually haven't tried that before. Maybe it works, maybe it doesn't. Yeah, so it works. He's a single author on all the books, so that's not super surprising. And then if we look back down at the code, since we can define how we calculate these fields, we can do kind of interesting things. So if we go all the way back up to the top, there's this translate function, and this interacts with the Google API for translate. And it'll go through and it'll translate the title to whatever language we might want to translate to. So how do we do that? Well, I can come here and I can specify a language, and I can specify it to say French. And I can click play, and there's the titles in French. So you can see as a front-end developer, this is kind of paradise because you get to see everything you can play with, and then you can interact with that data. You can this can be a total front-end function here. This translation going on. So you can really, it's super flexible on what it can do. And then it offloads the back-end developer. Your job is just to expose all the data you can. You have permissions to worry about and other things. But you expose everything that you want people to access, and then they can access whatever they like. And you can think of situations where, it's not only overfetching data that's a problem with REST APIs. If I'm getting a user profile, for instance, with a REST API, and say I'm inlining the avatar because I want to load the image via JavaScript. I want to load your thumbnail. Now, if I'm on a slow mobile connection and that thumbnail is a megabyte, and you've inlined it to me, and now I have to take it even though I don't want it. So I can do things like I can pass in flags to turn those off, but this is now the backend developer has to have all these case statements going on what you want. Here you just do it. You don't, if you don't want the image, you don't take it. Questions up to here? Anything? No? So we're gonna go through just we have 4 examples that we may or may not get through, and this next example, it's a bit messy, but it's just to see what kind of GraphQL looks like in Ruby, because I know we have Ruby developers in the room. Okay, so this is just a Sinatra app. It's not a Rails app because I wanted, I've used GraphQL there is a GraphQL, obviously a gem that plugs into Rails and sets up a GraphQL endpoint in Rails. I like to know where the magic happens in Rails often. Like it's nice to have it, but it's also nice to know where it comes from. So this does a couple different things. For one, and so the example I started with here just had a very simple database with a list of speakers, and then you could just query the database for speakers. So you see we have an endpoint. We have a standard sort of REST endpoint here for speakers, so we can go here and we can look, and I've already generated these. You have an ID, name, Twitter handle, some other things, right? BIOS, etc. And then we have a GraphQL endpoint, and this GraphQL endpoint takes in a schema. So we look at where is the schema. So if I go into GraphQL and I look at the schema, well, it doesn't do a whole lot. It just imports the query and executes the query. So we go over to the query. We have our 3 types. So we have a speaker, a comment, and post. And then we define these types. So it looks similar to JavaScript. You have a type is just a GraphQL type. You define fields in that type. And then those fields, you define how are you going to calculate those fields. So in this case, you have a resolve function that takes in whatever object. This could be a Rails model, for example. And then you have some arguments that you can pass in, like when we passed in the ID that for the author before, and then you have a context where you pass in the current user or API limit, or these various things. Nothing spectacular there. So I defined a couple different fields just with comments and posts. These are just boring Ruby models. So if we look at the types, you have a comment type, you have a post type, and you have a speaker type. So they're all pretty similar. You can specify some fields on them. They have a sense of validations. So if you specify that it cannot be null and you query something, it will throw an error. And then if we look, these map to models. So if we look in our models directory, these are just really stupid Rails or Ruby models. I'm just generating some fake data here, and there's nothing special going on here. If we go to our GraphQL endpoint, so now we have this query again. If I look, I can see that, so we went over all that, but if I was actually just writing a client for this, I wouldn't look at that. I would just open GraphQL and I would just look at this immediately to see what I could do. So I could get all the comments, for instance, and the comments are not very exciting. I think I have a post. Yeah, it should have some text on there, but or I could do something like I could go ahead and we had speakers before, so I can just, if you don't specify what type of operation you're doing, it's a query, so I can get the speakers, and I can get their talk title and their bio, for instance. So there we go. Great. So this is GraphQL and Ruby. Not a very practical Ruby example, but it really shows you how it's just, it's just a query language plus a schema definition, so you can really do whatever you want inside of it. Next example is Star Wars. So they have a really cool, on the GraphQL docs, they have a really cool, all their queries are based around Star Wars, and they have a pretty good database centered around that. So the only file, so this is another Express app. The only file I'm going to show is now the schema, because it's defined in a little different way. This is actually using, GraphQL has its own schema language, and mostly you're writing, you're using wrappers around that are written in either JavaScript or Ruby or whatever language you might personally have. And if we go through, this is basically what it looks like. You have types, you have fields in those types, and you have how to calculate those fields. So it's just the same stuff in a slightly different way. But now we have some interesting things we can do. So now this is a more interesting database. So for instance, I can just ask who the hero of Star Wars is. It gives me this ID. We can look, and let's get his name. So it's R2-D2 overall. We can do things like, we can look at, I'm going to see if it takes anything. It takes an episode, and it lists me the episodes that are available. Super, super convenient. I have some queries here that are pre-computed. I already did that. So sometimes, I didn't mention, you can do multiple things at once. So I can have a hero here, this works fine, and then I can query something else. I want a character. I don't know what, I actually don't know the character ID. Okay, well that's null, but you'll see that here it's giving me the data, it's giving me a hero and a character. However, if I try to get two heroes, so maybe I want the hero from the Empire. Actually, I'm not sure how much I like Star Wars. Maybe that's sacrilege. And this is going to be Jedi. Now it's going to throw an error because it's not going to allow me to overwrite. I have I have two objects here I'm fetching, and they have the same name. So you can do this. You can give them names, and then we go over here and we come back, and we can run that, and now we get an Empire hero and a Jedi hero. Great. And the other cool thing we can do here is mutations. So now if I look, I can put in a mutation. This is live coding, but copy-paste style, so it's okay. Okay, so this is an example, GraphQL. So you have also a variable pane where you can pass in variables to the mutation or the query or whatever it might be. So you see this query takes in an episode and a review, and it's going to create that review, and it's going to return me. So here you can you just return whatever in the review you want to. It's going to return you the created review. So if I go ahead and I click play, then there it is, and now I can look and I can see if I have any reviews. So now I can query the reviews, and there it is. Great. There's loads of stuff. So what I should show here is actually the docs. So this, actually I'm going to close this. So if we go to the docs, you can provide a bunch of comments for GraphQL, and it will build these docs for you. So I can see on my top, actually, just delete all of that. Let me go back to my schema. So I see my top level schema. I have a query, a mutation, and a subscription. I can go into the query. I can see that these are all the top level things I can fetch. So I've never done a Starship before. There's another client that's pretty cool, which will fill in those queries for you. Actually, I should have a Starship. Problem is I don't know the IDs of these things, so that's probably going to be null. The last example that I'm going to show, because I know there's Rails people here. So I've built kind of a demo project using PostGraphQL, and PostGraphQL works on top of Postgres, and it builds your schema. Your GraphQL schema comes directly from your Postgres schema. So I wanted an example. So actually I've been working is for a few weeks now with AI Crowd, which you should all participate in. It's awesome. We're considering adding a GraphQL endpoint, and so I wanted to show what you get for free out of the box with PostGraphQL and Postgres. So I should mention that GraphQL, the worry for a lot of people, you're basically giving anybody access to your database, right? And this makes a lot of people uncomfortable, so you have to handle the authentication in some way. If you have an Express server, a Rails server, these places you have a place to do that. In PostGraphQL, you're really giving direct access to the database, so you have to do that in the database. And Postgres, actually, I did not know this. How many Postgres users do we have? Probably a lot of people. So Postgres has roles. Roles are awesome. I'd never used them before. They do everything. So you can really have row and column level access. You can do user authentication inside the database with something like JSON Web Tokens. I'm a big fan. Let's go over to that. So that's just, I've spun up just, if we look at the command, it's here. So I've just run the PostGraphQL server, and it's available on port 5000. It's not doing a lot right now, but already we can look at the documentation. So there's absolutely zero setup on this on my part, 0 lines of code. So I look, I have a query, and I have mutations, so let's go into queries. Pretty long. So it gives me, and in kind of a Rails way, it gives me a standard way of accessing things. I actually am not entirely familiar with everything in the code base, so you all batch stats, right? You'll fetch all the records with that. It's really, it figures out all the relations you have, that has many relations, it does all of that. So we can start off with a query, the one, so we can say, there's a lot of them, so it's kind of hard to go through. I can try to just run that, and there's my challenges. Whoops. So it has a standard way, it has edges and nodes, and we can go into, say, the tagline. I don't even know what the tagline is. Yeah, there we go. So in our demo app, we only have 2 challenges at the moment. And then the same goes for mutations. You can, we can go through, and it figures out all of the, if we go back to Schema, we also have all of our mutations. The problem I find now, so this is something I'm currently exploring, if we had started this from scratch, I would almost certainly go with PostGraphQL on top of Postgres for our GraphQL endpoint. Since we have all the validations already written in Rails, that's a little painful because you have to move all of that into the database. It's not more work if you start from nothing, but now that we're starting from something, it is more challenging. So I think that's about all I have in terms of the demo. So I know it's a lot of code to look at all in one go, and we can play around. I highly recommend, if you're interested in GraphQL, just spin up a GraphQL endpoint and play with it, because it makes it super easy to interact with the data. And I should say, so you have a number of different clients, which I did not show because personally I use the Apollo client. And do we have React developers in the crowd? So the Apollo client basically makes Redux not really worth it anymore. And it's pretty cool. So it has a way of, it does some intelligent caching of your queries, and it has a way of managing state. And I think, my personal issue with Redux was there's a lot of boilerplate going on with it, and Apollo just kind of eliminates that. And so, I think the community is going towards Apollo because there's also Facebook's, I believe it's called Relay, and then there's quite a few different options out there. And that's a whole, the client side is a whole other issue. But hopefully there's some questions, and otherwise, thanks for listening to me.
Thanks for the talk. Is it really meant to be a better interface to most traditional relational database, or is it also, is the community also pushing to another kind of database that might be, I don't know, more optimized for that kind of graph query?
What I like is that if I have my issues with Firebase, but so Firebase is, has anybody used Firebase? Firebase is is a Google. It gives you sort of, it's a key value, or it's a document database. It gives you a lot of real-time interactions for free, which is really cool. It has a number of points that I don't like about it, but there's a GraphQL adapter for Firebase, and there's a GraphQL adapter for Postgres, and I'm sure there's one for Redis and for Cassandra, and you can go on. And so for the front-end people, you can just say, you just use GraphQL, and that's all you worry about. They don't have to worry about anything else. So in that sense, it reduces a lot of complexity once you learn this one tool. They don't care what the data is in. And you can actually, like, the cool part also is you can think of, you can add functionality on top of that, you fetch data from the database, manipulate a number of ways, and then you send it out to your users. And that, for them, it looks exactly the same. So, other questions?
What about joins and somehow relating the data from different parts of the database, or?
Yeah, so you can see things where you have a user with a lot of posts. You can get those immediately, so that has many just comes very directly. You can do for instance with PostGraphQL, you can do computed functions in Postgres. I'm not sure they're called. I'm not a Postgres expert, but you can do functions inside of Postgres which do that. If you're using Rails, you can do standard stuff. You can do kind of.
Oh, so you do it at the server end. Like if you
so I should say that, so all these queries are getting converted to SQL somewhere, right? And there is some effort. You can imagine that they're not always efficient. So one of the drawbacks of GraphQL is you run the risk of hitting N+1 queries, and there are some plugins that it seems like most people are using immediately to try and avoid this. And then there's, at some point you can look at actually what it's executing. But I think there's, I don't really know the state there. I'm guessing there's a lot of room for optimizations going on there. Yeah. But we also get that with REST APIs, right? Or, once you start fetching a lot of things at once, these N+1 queries.
So as a front-end developer, you might make two different GraphQL calls and then combine it in the front end?
Well, generally you just make one. So you just get everything you want in one call, and it just does it. And and then there are front-end tools which will figure out, ways to optimize these behind the scenes if it's making.
Sure.
Yeah.
Since you put the onus of crafting an efficient query onto the user then, of the consumer of the API, rather than doing it correctly as a developer in Rails or whatever, how do you prevent bad actors from just slowing down your entire database for the people using the website?
Are you criticizing front-end developers?
No, I'm saying that they might craft an inefficient query with N+1 problems. Yeah. And that might cause a lock that would slow down the website for everyone else.
Yeah, that's definitely a risk. I mean, you can think of doing things like throttling or these types of things.
That lets you do it?
You have a layer when you define, so you have your fields and then you have functions which resolve the fields. And those, you can pass in a context, which might be how many API calls they've made in X amount of time. So you can do that kind of thing. Really, I think the goal is not to move that onus onto the front-end developer, but into the query language. So it's because you can put a lot of engineering into optimizing the query language and figuring out, identifying where the N+1s are, and then doing fetching in a more intelligent way.
Right.
Just a quick question about the spec itself. How has it been defined? It's originating from Facebook.
Facebook, yeah.
And is it still evolving somehow? Or what happened when you go from one version of GraphQL to the next one in terms of specification?
So up to now, I've had, I can't say I've been using GraphQL for a long time. So, but I can look at the different versions I've used. I've found really no issue. But also because you're building, since you can interactively querying the database like that is kind of magical. I'm guessing there's SQL tools which are maybe similar, but it's incredible. So you build your queries in GraphQL, make sure they work, and then you move them over into your client code, so you know that it works, and so it's kind of, I haven't bumped into an issue. But they've also, I think they started at least 4 years old. they've been.
And the client libraries that you're using either in your JavaScript project or Ruby project are maintained mostly by Facebook people? Or
So that I will say. So the Ruby client for GraphQL, there is some. So they made a switch from. They made a switch over. Initially, it was not a class-based type definition. So I think you can see that wherever. Maybe the speaker type is not a class. Oh yeah. So initially it was this sort of DSL, and you. So this is a speaker type. This is defined in the old way, and when you want to define them in a class way, which gives you some advantages, and it's the new way. You know, it's when they updated the API. This is what they changed. It was really tricky to get this to work, and the documentation is pretty bad. And I think there are some places where the documentation is poor. So that's more the pain points. It's not the spec of GraphQL itself. I think, I'm guessing the query, because the GraphQL has the GraphQL query language, and that's well defined. But it's all of the Ruby client, or the Ruby version, the Python version, you know. But also on the front end, I've only really had experience with Apollo, but I really like it. It's really nice. So.
Can we filtrate the data to Ruby?
Sorry?
Can you filtrate?
Yeah. So you have, well, you see, you know, you can pass in, for one, you can do it a number of ways. You can pass in, you know, a lot of, okay, this is a bad example. So you can pass in, for one, like you can take all a collection of objects and pass in some sort of filter. You can compile this you can calculate this on the server. There's plenty of flexibility to do that wherever you want, and pagination is really straightforward, and you know, there's it's fully featured. I don't think, I don't feel lacking on any functionality.
Any more questions? Well, thanks a lot.
Thanks, guys.
Some goals for the holidays?